What's up everybody? Now that we've all gotten a chance to play the new 3-2-1 Triple DPS experiment, how does this game mode actually compare to 2-2-2? Is it actually a viable replacement to help fix queue times and possibly even make Overwatch more fun? In this video, I'm going to delve into my thoughts regarding each of the tank heroes and the changes they underwent, along with my thoughts on playing the DPS and support categories as well, to analyze whether Triple DPS could possibly actually work as the new standard game mode. This is Master Ian Gamer, and let's get into it. Now, starting off with just a general feeling of how Triple DPS actually sort of feels, it's much more chaotic, for sure. A large part of that could be just because so many people are jumping in and just wanting to experience it. They're not really worrying about playing viable team comps, or even trying to look for specific strategies. They're basically just playing things that seem interesting. Maybe they get to pick their favorite DPS because they don't normally get to do that very often, or they just want to try out the new tank changes. So definitely at this point, there's still a lot of factors to consider when it comes to the actual experience we're getting. But the one thing which definitely stands out is that this game mode is much more chaotic. Now, looking at the specific heroes, let's start with the tanks. In general, the tanks feel like gods, basically. I'll be honest, I actually had more fun playing as tanks than I expected I would in this game mode, simply because of how they've been buffed and the fact that, well, in many cases, they're kind of just unkillable. A lot of people are making this sort of mini raid boss comparison, and for most of the tank heroes, I do get that feeling. Not for all of them, definitely, and I'll get onto that now as I start to dig into these specific heroes individually. Let's start off with the off tanks and their interesting changes that made them more in line with the main tanks. First up, Roadhog. Roadhog, I don't think really works. In my experience playing as and against him in the Triple DPS experiment, he feels just more annoying to play against, but worse to play as. Like, he can't deal as much damage anymore, and just the way that he's the center focus of all the enemy fire just makes him not feel very satisfying to play. Trying to play Roadhog as a main tank doesn't feel good. I mean, you can tell that he was just never intended to do that from the beginning, and so now that Blizzard is kind of trying to shoehorn him into that position, even with his buff to take a breather, it just doesn't really work, and I think he would be better off just being dumped into the DPS category if they ended up going through with pushing Triple DPS as a new format. At the same time though, his take a breather buff is really annoying to fight against. It's basically just a supercharged version of Soldier's Biotic Field, and he can just drop that every 8 seconds to heal himself, heal his teammates, and just reduce the damage they take. It has been pretty difficult getting used to the changes to take a breather and just having this weird sort of damage reduction healing aura on the field, but overall, I can't say that I really like the direction they pushed Roadhog in. He's fun to play around with as, but I don't think he would work well in this position. He would have to obviously undergo substantial additional changes if they ever wanted to take this game mode seriously. Moving on to D.Va, hers was not quite as outlandish as Roadhog's. Her main thing was the defense matrix getting buffed, which feels very powerful and broken in the way that it used to feel back in the day before she underwent all her substantial nerfs and everything for Defense Matrix. The fact that you can just eat the entirety of a Pharah rocket barrage, I don't know, makes Defense Matrix feel broken in a lot of regards, but at the same time, a very terrible alternative to having an actual barrier. Overall, D.Va feels like she plays basically the same as she normally does, except she has an overpowered Defense Matrix. But given that you don't have a main tank on your team to fall back behind once your defense matrix runs out, she just kind of feels like she ends up dying a lot, even with defense matrix being as strong as it is. Again, she's really not filling that role of the main tank, and I don't think she would work super well as is if this mode became more mainstream. And next up, we have Zarya. There are 2 words to describe Zarya. Zarya is basically a broken god in this game mode. Her multi-bubble ability is just crazy strong whenever your team is actually grouped up enough for it to be utilized, and because of it, she's basically always at high energy. She can deal tons of damage from this, on top of the fact that with her 100 shield buff, and the fact that since she's the only tank, typically the supports on her team are going to be pocketing her 90% of the match, Zarya never dies. So many times when I was playing this, it would just come down to me as Zarya or a Zarya on my team facing off against an enemy Zarya. Both teams have a Mercy pocketing the Zarya, and then maybe like a Zenyatta with their healing orb on them, just firing at each other and just neither team dying. I will say it's kind of fun just because of the power fantasy aspect, getting to play her like this, but oh my god, is she crazy broken. Again, she would definitely need some much more extensive tuning if this was ever to be a main game mode that ends up getting implemented, because as is, Zarya is just crazy OP. Now, moving on to the other more conventional main tanks and barrier tanks that we have in game, starting with Orisa. Orisa is basically trash. Even with her barrier buff, which is technically just a reversion to what her barrier used to be, it goes down so quickly when the enemy has 3 damage heroes on their team. She just cannot hold up, and without any sort of off tank to back her up, once the barrier does go down, Fortify is hardly anything to contest with the damage, and she'll just drop dead instantly. On top of that, she's always getting flanked. If the enemy team has so much as just a decent tracer that can just consistently get behind you, Orisa just can't do anything. She's going to be trying to turn around to deal with the tracer because God knows the DPS on her team aren't going to help her out, and then she turns around, the barrier is just gone instantly, and then she just gets shot in the back and dies. Basically, every time I tried playing Orisa in the triple damage experiment, I just ended up switching off to a different hero because it just seemed like any other tank would be better. She just can't hold up to the immense amount of damage that's being dished out by the enemy, and her highly immobile playstyle just ends up making her a sitting duck for anyone who can get even something of a backwards angle on her to just get around her barrier. So she's definitely not in a good spot in this mode. Moving on to Sigma, he's pretty similar to Orisa, except not quite as bad. The fact that he has a fairly well-rounded kit and can sort of defend himself even after his barrier goes down, at least more substantially than Orisa can, made him feel like he had a bit more proper sustain against the enemy. Again though, it just didn't really feel like he had a whole ton of options when it came to actually combating the enemy. Like, depending on which tanks the enemy was running, he often felt just very susceptible to, well, basically anything the enemy would do. Roadhog could just yank him out as soon as the barrier goes down. Zarya can just beam through his kinetic grasp. He just didn't really feel strong, which I guess is kind of his position overall as is at the moment. But I will say that I do really like the buff they gave his barrier. Having it recharge more quickly felt really nice, so at least he had that going for him. I almost wouldn't be against that buff just being something they pushed to the main game modes and not just in the experiment, although I understand that Sigma of course has a lot of issues at higher ranks with being incredibly powerful when his barrier is too strong. But just as a note, I did think that his barrier buffs in the experiment felt really nice. Next up, Reinhardt. Reinhardt didn't feel that different when I was playing him in this mode. Of course, he has the extra hammer damage, which felt a bit wonky because like frequently I'd end up killing someone when I didn't think I was going to otherwise. It's like, oh yeah, he deals 90 damage instead of 75 now. His barrier felt, just basically the same. The armor buff on him, I guess, was slightly noticeable. Just having a bit more sustain in that regard was nice. But overall, while playing Reinhardt, it felt very reminiscent of like the olden days of Overwatch. Back before roll queue, when it was typical to get 3 or 4 DPS on your team, and you as Reinhardt were the only tank. And what I mean by that is that there was a lot of just standing there on the point with your barrier up and hoping that people utilize you. There were more than a few occasions where I found myself just standing on the point for long lengths of time, just sitting there thinking, I hope my healers heal me, because otherwise I'm going to get killed by these Genjis and Tracers that are constantly flanking behind me. So that was definitely interesting, getting to relive the less than positively remembered olden days of Reinhardt and early days of Overwatch. But I will say the hammer buff did feel nice, just getting to kill people a bit more easily. And when the supports on your team were focusing you properly and getting the heals, he did feel kind of godly in the way he could just rush forward and tank through through a lot of stuff. But at the same time, if the enemy DPS were coordinated enough to all focus on you, it did sort of counteract that feeling, and then he would just end up dying pretty quickly. Like most of the tanks, basically. The last tank of note, Winston, didn't feel much different either. Despite having a few changes to his health and his barrier, I didn't really notice those to any extent. But one thing that I did find interesting about him was that I found myself playing him a lot. And it was entirely due to the fact that the enemy was almost constantly running snipers and Sombra. Which leads us now to the DPS portion of this video. What is it like playing DPS heroes in Triple Damage? Well, as I just said, a lot of snipers and a lot of Sombra. I'll be honest, starting with the Sombra bit, I wasn't really expecting that many people to actually play her. Of course, you would have a bit more viability when you're not relying on both DPS to be someone that can deal a ton of damage, and now you can have room for the more utility-based DPS heroes, but Sombra showed up like at least once in probably the majority of my matches. And when she did, she was very, very annoying. Not having the extra barrier or off-tank peel to keep her at bay, basically, meant she was able to get in hacks constantly, and it was very annoying. I'll just say it, it was very, very annoying. Beyond Sombra, though, a lot of people seem to really like playing snipers, which again, brings back some not so pleasant memories of the olden days of Overwatch before role queue. Like Sombra, the vast majority of my matches had one or more Widowmakers in them, and without the extra tanking mechanics to obstruct her, she basically went unobstructed in most situations. Now, I personally am terrible at playing snipers, so I didn't really try playing as them at all during this experiment, but I could just tell, no matter what role I was playing, that snipers absolutely dominate in this game mode, which, again, makes sense given how much we used to see them back when you would regularly have 3 or 4 DPS per team. So I guess it's really not surprising at all to see them suddenly surge back into prominence now that there's 3 DPS standard, and of course the enemy can have at most 1 barrier. Now, when it comes to actually playing DPS heroes themselves, I didn't play them a whole lot in this experiment. In quick play and competitive, I'm predominantly a tank main and play a little bit of support on the side, but very rarely ever play DPS. But the one prominent thing which I really picked up on from playing them in this experiment for the small amount I did, there's very little weight and pressure on any one DPS player in this mode. Like, very frequently I felt like I could just play Junkrat or Torbjorn and just sort of spam fire into the enemy, and I didn't really have to try that hard because ultimately whatever I ended up contributing was so insignificant compared to the fact that there were 2 other damage heroes and the overpowered tank on my team. It just felt like I was there helping out, but wasn't really that important. In a sense, it actually reminded me a bit of Team Fortress 2, where in the casual game mode, they're teams of 12 versus 12 instead of 6 versus 6 like in Overwatch. And in TF2, you can basically just do whatever. You can just faff about, not really contribute, and then your team can still end up winning if the players on your team are just good enough to beat the enemy. That's kind of how it felt playing DPS with Triple Damage. I could just sort of do my own thing, shoot at the enemy, and as long as I was at least somewhat trying, then our team actually had a fair chance of winning. Again, I didn't play a whole ton of damage, and it could just be the poor matchmaking for this game mode that led me to win a lot in that situation, but overall it did definitely feel like a lot of the sort of weight and pressure and importance of the specific players was shifted away from the damage players specifically, and overall I think just sort of collected together on that single tank which each team has. And playing as that tank was kind of fun, but again, that's a lot of pressure. Especially in a competitive sense, I could see this being incredibly stressful for a lot of people, so that's definitely something to note about this mode overall. Moving on from DPS though, what did it feel like to play supports? Well, kind of unexpectedly, supports were absolute hell. By far, playing support was the worst experience I had in this mode overall, because they die constantly. Now, a lot of this could just be that I'm not the best support player. I don't have nearly as much experience on support as I do with tanks, and perhaps I've just gotten used to the playstyle of being able to rely on tanks to give me a barrier or a bubble or whatever to keep me safe. But overall, I just found myself basically constantly exposed while playing a support. with only one tank to offer me cover, it just felt like I was constantly getting sniped from some random place on the map, or having a Genji or a Tracer flank behind me and pick me off, and since there's no off tank to protect me from those sort of situations, I would die almost every single time they actually managed to get behind us. Now, this is a sentiment which I've seen reflected quite a lot on the forums and Overwatch subreddit so far, which I find kind of interesting because when Jeff was originally talking about the 132 team comp on the forums months ago, back in January, he mentioned that it was actually split pretty evenly amongst the supports. Some support people thought it was more hectic trying to keep up with the 3 damage and then not having the cover of 2 tanks, while other supports actually apparently enjoyed it because they didn't just have to focus predominantly on healing the tanks. But from what I've seen so far, the vast majority of support players hate this mode, and I absolutely have to agree with them. So, in conclusion, how does Triple Damage 132 team comp actually feel overall? Well, it started off feeling very nostalgic in a good way, getting that sort of old Overwatch feel where it's much more hectic, things aren't so set in stone with specific comps you have to use. It felt kind of cool being a super-powered tank who could sort of run in and be the mini raid boss of the team, essentially. And I'll be honest, at first I was really enjoying it, but that pretty quickly went downhill when I was reminded of all the reasons why pre-roll queue was an absolute nightmare. If there's one thing I've learned so far from this experiment, it's that it's made me way more appreciative of 222 roll queue than I think I've ever been in the past. Now that I've actually sort of gone back and felt again what it was like in the hectic days, yeah, no thanks, I never want to go back to there again. That doesn't mean I wouldn't ever play the experimental card again though, because I do think there's quite a bit of fun to be had, but I think just the triple DPS format just brings out the worst of DPS players. Like, I forgot how much I could hate the DPS on my own team until I played this game mode again. In 222, I never feel like I have an issue with anyone. My supports, thanks guys, I love having you heal me when I'm playing the tank. The damage, I love being able to make space for you, and I love when you get those picks. But when you take away my off tank or the main tank I'm supporting and replace them with another DPS, and then everybody just ends up going snipers and Sombra, yeah, I probably got more tilted playing last night than I have in a very long time. And that's saying something because I am not a toxic player by any means. I'm usually pretty chill about this sort of thing. So in closing, I did have enough fun in this game mode that I will be kind of sad to see it go. Jeff actually mentioned on the forums last night that apparently it's only going to be up for at most a week, which really shocked me when I saw that because I was expecting them to have this up there for at least the better part of a month, just so they could sort of have more people try it out, gather more data from it, get a more comprehensive feel of how players actually enjoy the mode. But apparently it's just going to be up there for a little bit and then gone, which actually kind of makes me a bit sad. I would love to have this as an arcade game mode, sort of like Quick Play Classic, where you could just play it when you felt like it and otherwise don't. I mean, maybe they could even do something where they have like an alternating schedule between Quick Play Classic and this game mode, where maybe it'd be like every week it swaps between the two, or even every day. Something like that I think could be interesting. More than anything, I'll actually be kind of sad to not get to play OP multi-bubble Zarya or even the new version of Roadhog anymore, just because they're different twists on heroes that I already really enjoy playing. It's just nice having those extra options, and to an extent it almost felt like playing a new hero while playing them. I will say, if nothing else, I have gotten some new hero concept ideas based on these reworks for Zarya and Roadhog, so I'll have to see if I can work those into some future videos of mine on my channel. Anyways, these have been my long thoughts after having played the experimental card. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you like the triple damage format? Did you get any fun out of it whatsoever? Or maybe it's just a nightmare for you and you never want to touch it again. Either way, be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this video and share it with your friends if you really liked it. Subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and hit up the bell to never miss any of my future Overwatch content. This is Master EN Gamer signing off, and until next time, have a great day.